Hello, everyone, and welcome to Walking Through the Bible. Unfortunately, the prosperity gospel, which preaches that the more you give, the more God will bless you with riches, not only distorts the gospel of Jesus Christ, but it also turns people off from learning about and obeying Jesus. That's because the preacher who preaches this gospel is usually a millionaire, driving around in fancy cars, flying in expensive private jets, living in mansions with every modern convenience that one could desire, all furnished by the giving of the congregation, while those who give rarely have any of those things. The fact of the matter is, the Bible doesn't teach that the more you give to the poor, the more rich God will make you. However, it does teach that when you give to the poor with the proper heart, God's will is being done, and that God will bless the person who does so. Let's see how this ties in to what we've been reading about in 2 Corinthians 9. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to be reading from verses 6 to 15. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning at verse 6. But this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. So let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to make all grace abound towards you, that you, always having all sufficiency in all things, may have an abundance for every good work. As it is written, he who has dispersed abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness endures forever. Now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness, while you are enriched in everything for all liberality, which causes thanksgiving through us to God. For the administration of this service not only supplies the needs of the saints, but also is abounding through many thanksgivings to God, while, through the proof of this ministry, they glorify God for the obedience of your confession of the gospel of Christ, and for your liberal sharing with them and all men, and by their prayer for you, who long for you because of the exceeding grace of God in you. Thanks be to God for his indescribable gift. Over the past two chapters, Paul has been talking about the collection for the saints in Judea. This is the same collection that Paul wrote about in 1 Corinthians 16 and Romans 15, and the one carried out in Acts 20 and 21. The Corinthians had decided more than a year previous that they would help the needy saints, but were waiting for Paul to arrive so that he could accompany this gift to Judea with some of their own messengers too. The thing is, Paul delayed coming because of the sin that needed to be corrected in Corinth, which was the purpose of the book we call 1 Corinthians. Thankfully, we find out from 2 Corinthians 7 that these problems had been corrected, but was this collection now ready? Was there some opposition to it going, or at least going in what had originally been planned? Paul had been boasting of their willingness and their zeal to give to the needy saints, and so if Paul was going to be proven wrong, it would be an embarrassment to him and to them. So Titus, on his own accord, decided that he would go and ensure that the Corinthians were ready to fulfill their promise, and he was accompanied by two devout, unnamed Christians in this task. In verses 6 to 15, Paul gives the Corinthians the reason that they should desire to fulfill their promise. It was not because they were being forced or coerced to by Paul. That would be grudging giving. It was not because they were required to give for this work by God in order to be a Christian. That would be giving because it was a necessity. Rather, they should desire to fulfill their promise because he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows abundantly will also reap abundantly. Now, there's a lot of confusion about what this passage means, so let's discuss it for a few moments. Let's first deal with the analogy. The way seed was often sown in that day was a sower would take a bag of seed and go out into the field and toss the seed into the air, allowing it to fall onto the ground. This seed would land on different types of soil, and so depending on which type of soil it landed on would determine your crop yield for that year. We saw this principle applied in Jesus' parable of the sower that we studied back in Matthew 13, Mark chapter 4, and Luke chapter 8. Knowing that not all the seed you sow will produce fruit, If you're a farmer and go out in the field to sow seed, and you throw just a little seed in the air, some will fall on wayside, rocky, or thorny ground and not produce much, if any, fruit. Only some will fall on good ground and produce fruit. Sure, you saved money on seed, but your crop yield was low, so you wouldn't be able to sell the fruit for much money either. If, however, you bought more seed, go out into the field and threw all that seed into the air, you're increasing the chances that more of it will fall on good ground. And when more seed falls on good ground, you'll produce more fruit. Yes, you spent more money on that seed, but you more than made up for it with the amount of fruit that was harvested. Now, looking at this, it is very easy to see why people believe that this passage is teaching that the more money you give, the more God will give you in return. But just from the context of the passage, we know that's not true. The Macedonians were not being scolded for not giving a lot of money in comparison to the Corinthians. They gave from their poverty not so they could be made rich physically, but so that their neighbors in Judea could be helped. This passage is not teaching a prosperity gospel message. It is teaching, though, that when Christians give purposefully, out of a love for God and the accomplishment of His will, they will generally give more liberally and more work can be accomplished. There was a real need in Judea for the poor. The Corinthians had means, and they had pledged to help. By fulfilling their promise, the benefits in fulfilling the will of God would be greater for them, for they would know that more saints would be helped. And this is true even in evangelism. When Christians see the value in going out and teaching the gospel, and the church is active in doing so, then Christians often give more liberally than they would if the church was doing nothing. This allows more work to be done and more fruit to be produced. Whether it's preaching the gospel or helping needy saints, the fruits of righteousness produced by the Christians involved will not be overlooked by God. God is the one who blesses us, and so in doing God's will, Paul does teach that God will not forget the needs of those who do His will. Paul quotes Psalm 112, verse 9 when he does so, and that verse says this: He has dispersed abroad, He has given to the poor, His righteousness endures forever, His horn will be exalted with honor. In that psalm, the psalmist tells of the blessings that God bestows upon the righteous who do His will. No, God does not make all His followers rich, but He does provide for them. Sometimes that is directly blessing the work of their hands, and sometimes it is through the charity of others, but God does bless His followers with their needs. Some people might hold back on giving to the poor because they believe that they will be made poor by doing so. Paul is telling the Corinthians that they shouldn't fear that, for God will provide for them. Paul does not say that the more you give, the more God will bless you. Rather, he is saying if you follow the Lord's will and give with a cheerful heart that loves the Lord and accomplishing His will, if you give that which you have purposed beforehand, not because you feel that you have to or are being coerced to, then not only will you be able to be glad that more of the Lord's work was being done, and not only will those receiving this gift glorify God for your generosity, but the Lord would continue looking out for your needs because you have a desire to continue in His grace. All of this should cause us to be thankful to God, for He provides for the needs of His followers. I have known many people in my life who are very charitable in spite of not being rich themselves, who never seemed to lack necessities in spite of their giving. Why? Because God obviously was blessing them. He never made them rich, but He didn't leave them in need either. The heart of the Christian is to be a willing, cheerful giver, not because we have to, but because we want to, and because we want God's will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, before closing, we do need to quickly correct something else that is sometimes taught from this passage, from verse 13 especially, which is that while the collection taken up by the church was primarily given to the saints, that non-saints, non-Christians, were included as well because of the use of the word all men in verse 13. The theory goes that because of this, the churches also have the responsibility to feed the poor of this world instead of leaving that job to the individual Christian. The problem with this view is that whenever this collection is specifically mentioned in chapters 8 and 9, it is clearly identified as a ministry to the saints. Why then is all men used in this passage? Well, first, men is italicized in most Bibles, signifying that a word was added in order to make the passage clearer to understand. Without this addition, the verse would read, "And for your liberal sharing with them and all." The question is, all what? To find out, let's determine who Paul is referring to. Notice here that in verse 13, the subject of the sentence changes from the Corinthians to those receiving of their liberality, the saints in Judea. They are the ones praising God for this, for the actions of the Corinthians bring glory to God's name. Thus, people are thanking God that the Corinthians shared of their liberality with them personally. But the saints in Judea firmly would believe that the Corinthians wouldn't simply help out needy Christians in one place, but as they had opportunity would help needy Christians in other places too. That is the all in verse 13. All men is not a misapplication, for in context we can see that all men means all Christians, but the addition of men does not leave the passage out to a misinterpretation if the context is not read in its entirety. The work of the church is to help needy saints as they have ability. It is to do so cheerfully, not grudgingly or of necessity, but purposefully. Christians are to take this same attitude and help the needy in this world as they have ability and opportunity. And we should really be seeking out those opportunities so that we can accomplish the Lord's will in all things. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 to 6, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. We thank you for watching Walking Through the Bible today. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below. But if you like this video, we ask that you consider subscribing to our channel so you won't miss out on other videos in our series, as well as share this video among your friends so that the saving message of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.